My name is Chris Dannen. I'm the CIO at Iterative Capital Management in New York. Today we're going to talk about driving factors in the crypto phenomenon as kind of a segue to the last panel, where a few folks asked, what will business adoption actually look like? How does permissionless public blockchain collide with highly proprietary and secretive corporate business practices that we're all familiar with today? So hopefully this is interesting. If you guys, if anything doesn't make sense, just raise your hand and feel free to ask. So this is me. What we do at Iterative is pretty basic. We have two businesses. One is a mining fund that invests purely in mining and mining operations. The other is an over-the-counter trading desk that sells blocks of proof-of-work crypto like Bitcoin and Decred and Litecoin, Zcash, those kind of things. What we're going to talk about today is how I think Bitcoin actually undermines the very structure that corporations take today. They're very organizational design. And the connection between how companies work today and how Bitcoin works may not be immediately obvious to people, so that's what I'm going to try to flesh out through this talk. So just briefly, my background, I'm from New York City. I went to UVA where I rode and I studied literature and computer science. I worked as a corporate ethnographer for 2 different management consultancies with a specialty in STEM and technical departments, and I'll talk more about what the hell corporate ethnography is in a second. I taught myself to program for the iPhone and founded an iOS development agency with a friend of mine that is still doing very well. I'm still a co-owner and on the board there. And we launched Iterative Capital, myself and my business partner, Brandon, who was just up here in the center of the room, in 2016. So this is how I started my career, going into C-suites of big companies and asking them what's wrong or what do you think is wrong, and then going out into the company and interviewing people at various levels and different roles to try to figure out if the C-suite was seeing things correctly or if they misunderstood the problem. And then the sort of outcome was try to find some resolution that made sense to both the rank and file, the management, and the C-suite, who often have very different priorities. So I want to give an example of what that actually looks like really quick before I go on, because that's a little abstract. So one example of a project I did early in my career was I went to a large medical manufacturer who was a client of ours. They're actually based in Europe. If you went to any hospital here in the US, you'd find their wound care and ostomy care stuff in the closets. There are very few companies that make this stuff. When I talked to the C-suite, they were looking for new lines of business. They had a lot of cash. They didn't know what to do. Should we buy a company? Should we start something new? Should we reinvest in facilities? And I said, well, what are you good at? And they said, we're an R&D company. We're really good at R&D. And then when I talked to the R&D department, they said, we haven't filed a patent in 30 years. We are a commodity plastics manufacturing company. So this is an example of how the C-suite can have their ideas about what they tell the market, what they tell investors, how they see themselves. And then the reality on the ground for the practitioners that actually do the work can be very, very different, right? So, and it's usually a lot less romantic in the weeds. So this is the tip of a very big iceberg that hopefully we'll unpack as this talk goes on. So the benefits of kind of looking at how people behave in general in businesses are as follows. There's an entire field of economics called industrial economics that studies just how people organize and make things in a business context. And this is particularly relevant to M&A consultants. So if you work at McKinsey or Deloitte, you look at a lot of this stuff too. Because it's the foundation of strategy, which I kind of think of as disaster management. So the prior example of having too much cash on your balance sheet is what we know is a good problem. Sometimes you have a very bad problem. You have a product that's a flagship, but it's not selling. You have a business unit that has a lot of overheads, but isn't actually producing any value. So if you start to look at how many systemic problems exist in big corporations, you are less and less impressed with their ability to get things done. And I think today we have kind of a popular perception of big corporations as being fairly competent, but I actually think if you stop and think about the examples of hacks and leaks and other examples of irresponsibility, you might find that actually big corporations are pretty incompetent at doing really basic things. So again, this is a useful approach to Bitcoin, is thinking about how people usually struggle to make something that works. So again, what does Bitcoin mean for traditional businesses, and how is Bitcoin as a development in this space different than the web or different than BitTorrent? BitTorrent obviously was very disruptive in the web too. We've got media companies and especially in news and music that are sort of struggling to stay alive or find new business models because of disruption in the web and BitTorrent. But the balancing factor, I guess, on the web or with BitTorrent is that a lot of the stuff out there is junk. So typically, when you end up paying for media or paying for news or music or whatever, it's to get the movie that you want to get the album that is actually not the bootleg version, get information that you think might be true from, let's say, a newspaper instead of just some pay-to-play blog. And Bitcoin sort of takes away that last vestige of advantage that proprietary information and services have, which is the plurality of spam. So what happens? Well, hopefully you guys can see these drawings on screen. The people that are most in danger here are the people that work in what we call the technostructure. So if you can see the diagram on the left here, this is a company. This is how a company works, kind of abstracted. This concept was ideated by a Harvard professor named John Kenneth Galbraith, who was very well known in the 1960s and 70s. I think he's dead now. The modification on the right comes from a guy named Henry Mintzberg, who did a lot of work in the 80s and 90s, another industrial economist. But you can think of the technostructure in general as being the management and the administrators, the people that do planning and allocating resources. So, when asking what happens now that Bitcoin has created a kind of service where spam is not an issue and the quality of this kind of peer-to-peer service is improving, well, that directly competes, or at least I'm going to argue in the rest of this talk, that directly competes with the jobs of these people who are generally to produce the right thing at roughly the right time in roughly the right way so that consumers buy it. So we all take management for granted. Everybody sort of assumes that companies have managers, but actually things were not always this way. From the beginning of the Industrial Revolution all the way until the Great Depression, the owners were the managers. So if you've ever heard stories about Andrew Carnegie, the great steel magnate, and how obsessed with efficiency he was, there's a famous story, I think it was in 1880-something, 1882, where he hired the Pinkertons, which were a private police force, to shoot a bunch of steel workers who were protesting for higher wages and better work conditions. Just shoot them. Fordism, the practices pioneered by Henry Ford, we tend to have a very rosy look of what Henry Ford pioneered. Again, all about efficiency, all about getting the most out of workers. He's another guy who, during the Great Depression, I think in 1931, hired a private police force to shoot workers that were protesting in front of his factory, and then he spent the rest of the Depression holed up in his mansion outside Dearborn with 2 machine gun emplacements in his front yard and a bunch of paid security. So the idea that management has always been kind of this fluffy layer that exists at every company is relatively new, and it actually developed as a result of the Great Depression. So the idea of professional managers were you hire people based on merit, they get their position based on their results and not their ownership stake in the company, which was obviously a fairly new thing. However, very quickly in the 1930s, there are economists who wrote studies about what were called at the time management-controlled companies, which were companies that the management very quickly figured out how to cow the ownership or cow the different groups of stakeholders, play them off each other, and essentially assume the same level of power and domination that the owners used to have. So, my point in recounting all this is that the question of who runs things and who makes the decisions has always been pretty fraught. And we're actually in kind of a time of unusual equilibrium right now, but this has always historically been an issue. So very quickly, management-controlled companies became very fraternal, let's say, to put it diplomatically. I think this is the era that is memorialized by the show Mad Men, where the managers are essentially drunk at work, doing whatever they want. No one is really there to tell them to get back to it. And actually, something really interesting happened as a result of this. Technical employees who didn't really want to be subject to the vagaries of potentially drunk or at least power-drunk managers started to withdraw a little bit from their institutions. They started to become less loyal to the C-suite and a little bit more concerned about their own work. And this was possible because technical workers, in many cases, they're the experts in their field or they're the experts in their division, and there's no one who actually can supervise them or can say that their work is nonsense or not. So starting in the 60s and 70s, excuse me, you started to have a kind of stalemate where managers were building little empires and just trying to score promotions and score bonuses, while the people who were actually building stuff were filibustering by engaging in projects that went nowhere. And obviously, eventually, the shareholders noticed this. And so we got the junk bond boom. So this handsome character on the right is Michael Milken, who in the 1980s, with his compatriots at a relatively unknown bank called Drexel Lambert, started selling what were known as junk bonds or high-yield bonds as a way to finance the takeover and breakup of companies. So this was actually not started by Michael Milken. It was started by a guy named Jim Slater in the UK in the 1960s, late 60s, and another character from the UK called James Goldsmith, and it eventually kind of took off here. So that's basically where we're at today. The shareholders, the activist investors particularly, sort of run the public corporations. They have a lot to say about who is in the C-suite. And some companies which have started since that period, like since 2000, let's say, the CEOs have found ways to reassert their dominance, and I'm thinking of Zuckerberg and Elon Musk by essentially structuring the company before the IPO so that they retain a lot of ownership. So this is, but again, empire building and dysfunction is still really rampant. I mean, Amazon's Prime Now unit is sort of the latest and greatest example of this. It's metastasizing like a cancer. Nobody can really stop it. If you talk to people inside that division of Amazon, it's very confusing. But again, the point here is that there is this constant struggle between the people who are doing the work, the management, and the ownership, who all have slightly different priorities and ideas about how to achieve those priorities. So this is how we end up in a world of Dilbert management, where the managers ask for too much and they sell on a promise because they're trying to please the shareholders. And they sell their engineers upriver a lot of times by promising things that can't be built or won't be built or shouldn't be built. And this engenders a lot of resentment. So again, the power struggle, this is very much an up-to-date phenomenon, a phenomenon that matters today. Strikes, layoffs, M&A, all the things I list here, some of these they feel very historically based. But actually, you can spot other places where the social contracts inside companies are being broken. Now, if you want footnotes on all these, we have them in our thesis, which I'll put the link up for in a bit. And you can find footnotes for all news articles that document this stuff. But it's everything from Facebook moderators suing the company because they're traumatized because of how much child porn they've looked at moderating content. The same thing at YouTube, where they describe a daily ethics hell, trying to figure out the rules for what should be allowed on YouTube. And you have Google being protested by its own engineers for essentially improving the accuracy of drone strikes for the government. So oddly enough, people have known this was the case with corporations for a long time. This 18th century Chancellor of Great Britain kind of says it. But looking at the Facebook data leaks, looking at the Equifax data leaks, looking at the way Wells Fargo created a bunch of specious accounts for people like you and me just to score sales bonuses, and of course AT&T and Verizon spying for the US government, as we found out through Edward Snowden and WikiLeaks. So these are moral hazards that people inside big corporations who have important or technical roles deal with every day. And my point here is kind of that the management is a little bit removed from the daily realities or the daily ethics decisions of implementing these plans. I think the Wells Fargo example is a particularly good one. You can put a sales incentive in place, but without the rules to keep people on the road, it really goes awry. The housing crisis is sort of an example of this writ large. We have a bunch of banks generating a ton of debt and a ton of derivatives that nobody really wants and nobody will ever buy. But the problem is actually not unique to finance. All those examples I just mentioned, only one of them was a bank. This quote from the BBC of filmmaker Adam Curtis comes to mind about Occupy Wall Street. which he characterized as sort of going nowhere because it didn't really have an idea. It wasn't really revolutionary. It was evolutionary. It was a question of how you manage things. So once you have a company like Equifax that manages credit reports, how do you keep that thing from becoming compromised by the goals and incentives that people in the management layer of that company set? The idea of a credit reporting company may be a good idea in theory, but how do you actually manage that, right, without some people taking advantage of the system? So I would sort of hypothesize that the moral hazards of the managerial class exist across all segments of society and all sectors of business, and probably government too, although I'm less familiar there. And the core issue is that in many cases, not all cases certainly, but in many cases, the managers of the system are actually strangers to the work, and they're not really fully cognizant of what's going on or what the impact is on people in the marketplace, let's say, or who are participating in the system. I don't really believe that any Wall Street banker who was creating a bunch of nonsense mortgages really had a vision into what that would do to the rest of the economy in terms of unemployment, job losses, and stuff in the recession. They don't really see that. It's not in front of their faces. So this is the link to our thesis document if you want to look for some of the footnotes in here. I'll quote people where I can, but I'm trying to avoid footnote hell, so just go to the document. But so this is how we see the connection to Bitcoin. It's a resilient and efficient approach to organizing work, and unlike most free and open source software, that's the FOSS acronym, unlike most free and open source software projects, it has the qualities of a command and control project. Most FOSS projects are kind of lackadaisical, they're pretty casual, they're pretty relaxed. It doesn't mean the software is not good. The software is usually very good, but it usually means that it's not it's many times you have to build it from source yourself, or compile it yourself, run it yourself. The README may not have all the instructions you need. It's not necessarily as user-friendly as a commercial grade enterprise service. But Bitcoin actually, and Bitcoin wallets, they're not beautiful necessarily, but they come pretty close to being totally usable by somebody who really has no idea how the system works. And that's really impressive, and I think it's one of the first times. I mean, modern Linux distributions are also getting very user-friendly, and they're taking more UI kind of nods from Apple and from Microsoft, but it's still the case that this is a kind of distinctive thing. And it stands to reason that the industrial economist that I mentioned earlier, Henry Mintzberg, he observed, this is a paraphrasing quote, but he observed that technical workers are usually more in touch with the needs of the customer, because that is what informs the work they do every day, whereas the managers and the C-suite tend to support more abstract goals like growth and marketing narratives and a certain brand perception. So you have this kind of divorce within modern companies since the late 80s, let's say. And this problem really does matter to everybody. A lot of us work for big corporations or have. A lot of our friends and loved ones do. We all patronize them, even if we don't want to. We all have to use a major bank, typically, or Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn. And worst of all, we're all sort of invested in these things together through 401ks, ETFs, index funds, mutual funds. That is all that capital is propping up an incredibly dysfunctional system. So what's happening now is that the dysfunction is becoming like a bleeding from the neck problem, as we used to say in consulting. So an example here that I'll use is Pepsi. And what's interesting is that where you find speed as an issue in big companies, no matter what the sector is, if it's tech or consumer goods or whatever, it almost doesn't matter. The people who are always trying to move the fastest are the marketers. And the marketers are trying to move faster because more and more of their messaging channels are digital, social media type channels. And they're trying to capitalize on the moment, let's say. And they do it terribly every time. I mean, I think we were not involved in this, but Pepsi just recently released that Kylie Jenner police ad that got a lot of backlash. It was kind of considered to be, I don't know, a little bit ham-fisted, as they're trying to speak to the market in a language of the moment, right, in the language of what's happening now, and they're usually like a minute short or a buck late, or however you want to say it. So one of the projects I did at Undercurrent a few years ago was to help their Latin American marketing team make decisions in the field. So in marketing, you have the CMO who's typically a global CMO. Then you have a local CMO for that country, and then you have the field marketers who are actually either creating social media or they're out there in the field, handing out Pepsi or whatever. The issue that Pepsi was having in this particular project was some social media meme would pop up in, let's say, Brazil. The Brazilian field marketers would say, hey, can we make some social content about this meme? We really want to use it to highlight Pepsi. They would run that up the chain to their national CMO. Their national CMO would run it up the chain to the global CMO. And by the time the global CMO's decision got back down to the field marketers, the meme had passed, the moment was over, and the whole project was useless. So we essentially reorganized the Pepsi Latin American marketing divisions to make decisions on the ground about what to say on social media. And if you know how easy it is for companies to misstep on social media and say the wrong thing, then you'll have a sense of how kind of revolutionary important that is, to let the 25-year-olds who run the Twitter account actually decide what to say without actually approving the text, having some adult in an office somewhere in New York approve the text. So this is something that even businesses cannot ignore anymore. They know they need to move faster, and their structures are sort of running at odds with their priorities in the marketplace. So what's interesting is that it's someone like the global CMO at Pepsi who would hire us to solve this problem, and they're actually creating a trap for themselves, is what I would argue. Now, if we zoom out for a second and we talk about what are the trends in management consulting, how do big C-suite executives who we all think are very smart, how do they actually solve their problems? Excuse me. They hire two types of consultants. They hire data, AI, and ML consultants. This is the McKinseys and Deloittes and BCGs of the world who run the numbers and tell you that there's something surprising in there that you didn't know. And then there's the design thinking consultants, and that's what I did. So design thinking, if you're not familiar with that term, I'll sort of unpack how it applies to corporate strategy. It actually means the org chart and the seating chart. How do you put these people together and get them to make something? And what rules, incentives, and traditions are you putting in place to get them to repeatedly do the right thing and make the right decision? And actually that comes down to things like rituals, slogans, games, and exercises. I'll mention some more examples of what those look like, but there are a lot of things that big companies spend a lot of time trying to get people to think the right way so that they make the right thing. And it's very, very difficult to break old habits. So, as I said, the organization design and the seating chart actually really matter. Where you put people matter, who they sit with, who they report to or don't report to. All this stuff really matters. So I mentioned earlier on this slide here, rituals, slogans, games, exercises. The stuff of organization design here on this second bullet is actually like an operating system for the company. That's, in fact, a lot of companies call it their OS. Holacracy is a really popular example of an OS that some companies have adopted. Zappos is probably the most well-known company that uses Holacracy, a modified version of Holacracy. A lot of companies use the KPI framework, key performance indicators, where you set a goal and then at the end of the quarter or the month or whatever, you assess yourself on how well you met that goal. Google uses something called the OKR framework, Objectives and Key Results, which is sort of a modified KPI framework. You've probably heard flat organizations. You've probably heard about open floor plans. These are all organizational design tactics to try to get people to work better. This is something that I have direct firsthand experience in as an investor and board member at an LA architect called MRAD. Does work for Equinox and Blue Bottle Coffee. The Blue Bottle Coffee project was for a training center to train baristas. So I got to see firsthand how the architects at MRAD are designing the space to reflect the structure of the teams and then to reflect the process that the management wants the teams to use. So these are all really intimately connected ideas. And Apple's, circular design, where Steve Jobs famously wants people to kind of walk through a courtyard and bump into people. These are all elements of trying to create a company where people like to work there and they're doing good work all the time. And that's obviously a virtuous cycle. If they're proud of the iPhone, they look forward to going to work, and it sort of feeds a positive feedback loop. So you can actually see this now in the way that companies design their physical spaces. And what's interesting is that designing process used to be the job of the manager. You'd all get together in like a big boxy corporate building, and the manager would say, do things this way, and people would kind of grumble, maybe this isn't the best way to do it, but that's the boss, and so we do what this person says. But now that you know, design thinking and kind of iterative thinking has crept into the way companies design themselves, design their organizations, you see this parity happening between org design, the physical design of the space, the actual process of making the product, and the actual overall corporate strategy. They're all kind of melding into once. And my favorite anecdotal example of this is at GitHub. GitHub built a new office in, I think, 2015. And they put in place these things called coder caves, which are essentially small, low-ceilinged rooms with comfortable chairs, no windows, very dim lighting, and like carpet or fur on the walls. And it's dead quiet. I mean, it's like it's almost like a recording studio. And then you close the door, and it's like you're in space. And you know, there's just a little place for your laptop and to plug in. And I think they actually have kind of Faraday walls so that you can't get, you know, cell signals or whatever. You're only, you know, you're wired in, and that's all you have. This is an actual trend, not just at GitHub, but very big companies too, like Box, which went public a couple of years ago. It's been covered in the business press. I'll show you some examples that I wrote of that. But essentially what's happening here is the human-centric design that has worked really well for companies like Apple and you know, all the companies that, let's say, use an agency like Frog Design to design their products. You've probably seen those OXO can openers with the big fat handles. There is a certain kind of elite set of design agencies that a company can hire if they really, really care about human-centric design. And those agencies are tremendously profitable right now. Every big company is tapping them to see, you know, how they can optimize themselves, their operations, their product, whatever the case may be. An example here. So I wrote this story for Wired in 2014, and this story is about how Box was trying to, you know, they're trying to always beat Microsoft, Microsoft Cloud, Microsoft Office, and the way that they chose to do it was to become very design-centric. And they couldn't, this story is about how they had trouble getting their designers to really produce anything groundbreaking because the designers were sort of interspersed throughout the company, usually in teams of engineers. And when they asked the designers, you know, how do we help you do better work? What do you need? They requested to all be sat together in a big room, in a pod in the center of the company, and not to really have a ton of interaction with the engineers. Only talk to the customer, come back, do the design process, and then sort of push out results to the engineering organization. And that's, you know, that's not how Google does design, that's not how Microsoft does design, it's not how a lot of big companies do design. But it's really worked well for Box, and they've grown ever since then. But it's an example of how the desire to affect the end product affects the process, right? Let's get all the designers in a room and we'll have them hash it out. They actually call it a mini internal agency they created, and that affects the org structure, right? Suddenly you have this new group of designers that all work together. You no longer have designers interspersed, and that actually affects the architecture of the space. You now need a giant room like this where the designers can sort of play and put, you know, things up on the walls and draw on the whiteboards and whatever. So organization design really comes down to what's going on in individual teams. And when I was at Undercurrent, one of our most common functions was to companies put their, you know, troubled units into what we called SLAM teams. SLAM teams, that's an acronym, stands for semi-autonomous, lean, and multidisciplinary. So these are usually teams that are focused on a product or a problem. So in the design team's case, that's sort of a SLAM team, not as multidisciplinary, but a SLAM team that's meant to focus on the UI and UX of, you know, the Box cloud interface. And we did this work at American Express, at Pepsi, which I mentioned, at GE and GE Capital, at BlackRock, Climate Reality Project, which is Al Gore's climate nonprofit. So there are all sorts of different organizations that are trying to use this, what is essentially an open allocation, agile way of working as a means to get to a better product. And then they sort of find out that it blows up everything else. It blows up their seating chart, their org chart, their actual, you know, building blueprint. It has tremendous effects on the way the rest of the company looks. So how do you get at a worthwhile end product? How do you design a company that's actually working stuff and is doing right by the market? Well, design, just like science, is a process or a method of steps that you sort of rinse and repeat. In industrial design, is you know, we're all familiar with. You try to understand the needs of the user. You design something that you think meets their needs, you get their feedback, and you're constantly, and then you repeat. It's an iterative process of understanding the problem, making a better solution, improving your understanding of the problem, and then putting that new understanding of the problem back into the product so that it compounds and improves over every iteration. Some useful people to read if this is interesting to anybody. Frank Chimera has a free book called The Shape of Design, which I think is a really great entree into this process. And then the famous UC Berkeley architecture professor, Christopher Alexander, who's written many, many books on how to make things that people actually like using or like holding or like being inside of. And this has led to an axiom in the design world and the strategy consulting world that process is your most important product. So process, as we talked about, can go very wrong. Ever since 1904, this guy Thorsten Veblen, who's a historian and kind of an early sociologist, he's the guy who came up with the term conspicuous consumption to describe the way that the robber barons were exhibiting their wealth. He noticed as early as 1904 that industrial companies were producing what he called ceremonial or spurious sorry, that should be inventions, not intentions, which are essentially, that means the boss commands the workers to make something that he wants to see or she wants to see, but it may not be what the market wants. That is a spurious or ceremonial. It serves to reinforce their position of power and their position as the boss. It doesn't actually meet any need that the customer has or the market is speaking about. So, my insight kind of here at this point in the talk is that when process design is carefully considered, the organization takes shape without the necessity for the managerial class to maintain, morale, direction, purpose, process, and to actually make, kind of their own personal decisions about these things. That this becomes a sort of emergent process when you put it all together. So in 2013, I became really interested in this and approached Fast Company magazine about starting a little lab where all we did was interview people about how they did process and all the related stuff. So I did that for a couple of years and learned some really interesting stuff, which I'm going to share with you guys very briefly. So I did a long piece about GitHub, interviewed I think 8 of their managers and engineers about how they essentially don't have managers. So GitHub is an open allocation company. If you're not familiar with open allocation, it essentially means once you're hired, in a corporate context, it means once you're hired, no one assigns you to a project or to a team. You just work on whatever you think is interesting or needs to be done, and you're sort of managed by a process of peer review. This also is prevalent in the open source community. Obviously, projects like Bitcoin are managed on an open allocation basis. You don't need anyone's permission to, propose something on most public blockchains. You just get into GitHub, you write an issue or you write a gist, and people either like it or they don't, and typically if they like it, you're the one that's supposed to build it. It's not, there's very little capacity for people to walk into an open allocation system and create work for other people, like a manager might want to do. So that's fascinating. And then this is a piece that I wrote with the guy who's now the head of growth at Uber, Aaron Schildkraut. So he used to run a dating startup that was acquired by IAC. And we wrote a seven-part guide to exactly how he created the How About We product in painstaking detail. I mean, this story is like 20,000 words long. So is the prior one that I referenced. So what did I find coming out of studying all this? Well, if it's a big if you hire self-motivated, skilled, curious, and generally nice people, you give them a purpose, and you make the purpose really clear, like what problem you're trying to solve and who you're trying to solve it for, and you structure the goals and incentives correctly, you can basically leave them alone, and they'll make something really great. And in many cases, they'll make a lot of money. I mean, the GitHub in 2015 was just starting to sell enterprise licenses over the internet. And I think an enterprise license was like $100,000. So here's a company that is, well, I think 95% engineers. No one's running the show really properly. I mean, there are people that have the title of CEO and COO, but they are not assigning resources, not assigning work. And yet that company can produce a product that people will buy for $100,000 over the internet without talking to a human being. That's really impressive, and it's the kind of success we see from Bitcoin, right? Nobody's out there selling Bitcoin really properly. There's a lot of people selling Bitcoin alternatives or ICOs, but there's no marketing department for Bitcoin. There's very little marketing spend behind it, and yet it continues to be the market leader. It continues to kind of demonstrate its value to the people that know how to recognize it. So this is a very Bitcoin way of thinking. So this is actually taking root at scale. Microsoft is one of the biggest progenitors of open allocation in the corporate context. It's driven mostly by their acquisition of Yammer. There was a guy at Yammer, I think he was the co-founder of Yammer, named Adam Pisoni, who I worked with at Undercurrent. And the general approach to this they're calling it responsive org. I guess they don't like open allocation, whatever they have to brand it. Is essentially that the goal here is to reorganize companies through design thinking so that the structure and roles really accurately reflect the need of different groups of experts, meaning the employees who are coming together to build the thing each day. So it's not rocket science. It is teaching companies to not waste their employees' time and resources and effort through, the spurious commands of some manager, and actually just give them, tell them the problem and let them figure out how exactly to solve it. So why does this work so well? Well, actually, people have studied this. MIT, Sloan, the business school, and Boston Consulting Group did a study about this in 2005. So I'll read this for anybody that can't see it back there. We found that enjoyment-based intrinsic motivation, namely how creative a person feels when working on the project, is the strongest and most pervasive driver for voluntary work on software. Many are puzzled by what appears to be irrational or altruistic behavior. You're working on software that is free and open source. Anybody can take it and reuse it or change it. Giving code away, revealing proprietary information, helping strangers solve their problems. FOSS participants may be seeking flow states. I'm sure you guys have heard that term. Flow states by selecting projects that match their skill levels with task difficulty, a choice that may not be available in their regular jobs. So this is about self-directed learning and self-directed work. As it turns out, this is a core part of being happy in your job. So is there evidence that people are not happy in their jobs in big tech? Yes, absolutely. I mentioned, the Google engineers who protested their drone optimization program, but actually it's a lot worse than that. If you look at the article from the technology writer Nick Bilton in Vanity Fair, August 2018, he says, in Silicon Valley's halcyon days, employees didn't have any qualms about the ethics of the companies they were joining, since many honestly believed that they were going to advance a corporation that was going to change the world. The people who transformed the Bay Area into the greatest wealth generation machine in human history are now turning their backs on the likes of hegemonic corporations who, in their own depictions, moved fast and broke things without an end in sight. So there's a quote in here by an Uber manager, a senior-level Uber manager, who is afraid that they have, and he's talking, I think on background, so nobody knows who this person's name is, but saying that if they don't fix these ethical quandaries, they're not going to be able to hire the best engineers, and without the best engineers, they're fucked. That's the quote. They're fucked, and this is what this person said in Vanity Fair. So this is, even if it doesn't seem like it, if you log onto Facebook, it seems to work fine. I would argue that actually inside Facebook and inside and Google and a lot of these other big tech companies, there is a shocking amount of disenfranchisement that doesn't really get talked about. And when it is, it's kind of quickly suppressed. So after I left Undercurrent, I went and did this on my own at Bloomberg, and this is where Bitcoin, in I guess this was 2014 into 2015, really snapped into focus for me. I'm pretty thick, and I didn't really totally get this. Having looked at Bitcoin a few years before this, I didn't totally understand what was happening. So, but it was Bloomberg that sort of opened my eyes. So the project that I did for Bloomberg was a recruiting project. How do they recruit the best engineers at Bloomberg out of college? And so I had to spend a few months with the C++ infrastructure team, interviewing them, trying to get them to talk to me and open up. They're all older, senior engineers. They're kind of grizzled and unfriendly. But what I eventually learned was that they thought that the most appealing thing about working at Bloomberg was working on open source. And that may be counterintuitive if you imagine that people take a job because of the brand name, because they want to say that I work at this company and I'm proud of this company. You've heard of this company. It's legitimate. All these things. But actually, within the technical organization, the jobs that were most envied were essentially people who were paid Apache committers. So Bloomberg. I hope I'm not going ahead of my presentation here, but. Bloomberg has 2 Apache committers, and they're like the celebrities of the C++ team. And I was really impressed by this, and everybody sort of envied their roles because, number one, it takes a long time to become an Apache committer. You got to worm your way in. It's like being a Wikipedia editor to be a committer on one of these important foundational open source projects. And the other thing was they didn't have to listen to anybody. Those committers would go to work every day. They would just work on Apache stuff. They would do what they want. They'd talk to their other committers, and nobody could tell them boo. And that was a nice change as compared to, you know, the rank and file engineers who had to occasionally listen to a manager, sometimes a non-technical manager. So we ended up developing an entire blog called Tech at Bloomberg, which is still operating, which is all about how Bloomberg is using open source, and it's actually been a success. They get a ton of recruiting candidates through people who are just reading about, you know, oh, how do they, you know, the terminal uses Apache Solr for search. How do they implement that, and, you know, what were the challenges? Like, actually, engineers are really interested in that, and they want to solve a problem that is going to, that solution is going to reverberate in other companies. So, you know, that whatever those implementations of Solr improved the Solr framework enough that other companies are now using it in its new form. So that's really gratifying to a lot of engineers who like infrastructure software. So this was kind of the aha moment to me, which is that, you know, a job is not actually happiness, because the job doesn't actually always reflect the work that you're doing. You can work at an amazing company and have a shitty job or a shitty project or a shitty assignment. That actually what people are looking for when they join these companies is a project that they're passionate about and some income on the side. And those things don't necessarily need to be connected. And of course, in a Bitcoin context, you could think of this as buying Bitcoin early and contributing to Bitcoin, and then just watching it kind of improve and watching the market recognize its improvement in the price. Now, obviously, this is not as direct of a one-to-one type of relationship as we might be used to with employers, you know, where you start and you start getting a paycheck, but it satisfies the same requirements. And if happiness is your number one thing, and that is more important to you than getting that paycheck every 2 weeks in a very regular sense, then you might be willing to take the risk of working on a public cryptocurrency project and really kind of investing your career in it in a way that it's much harder to invest your career in, let's say, Linux, I think, unless you're actually selling a distribution of Linux or you're selling a service on top of Linux like Red Hat does. So you know, I think the gratification speaks for itself when you look at the quality of Linux and the BSDs and now Bitcoin. You know, it's obvious that the people that work on these things are really, really into them and really care about making them good, even though in most cases there's not somebody paying them to do that. So, in summary, Bitcoin is a really effective organization design. It allocates resources, both human resources and computing resources, and it creates an enterprise-grade software network without anyone controlling it after the launch. Obviously, you know, Satoshi said in his Bitcoin Talk post that he did kind of set the rules in stone at the beginning, but beyond that, there is no management really needed by any one key party. And so I think that this is going to have an economic knock-on effect on large enterprises who right now, you know, offer a very different employment experience. Bitcoin is actually manager-free in two different ways. It's not just that nobody's assigning the work, it's also that nobody is dictating the monetary policy. That monetary policy is automated. So essentially people are paid, you know, miners are paid in an automated way, and that seems to be enough to keep them around. In most open allocation projects, in practice, there is someone who is a leader. There's a great book about open source governance that is cited in the thesis, but leadership is kind of a rotating duty. And we saw this with Satoshi. You know, he was around, or she was around until 2010, 2011, something like that. Then disappears and kind of hands off leadership to other people. This is really common in FOSS projects, that the person who starts it doesn't necessarily stay the dictator for long, or there isn't a dictator for long, and it sort of gets passed off to a informal democracy where the key committers have some way of voting, you know, usually over email. There's lots of ways to do this, but you know, so what's the economic impact here? Well, motivation in Bitcoin is very cheap. You don't have to pay the engineers. You don't have to market to miners. You don't have to market to full node operators. They respond to their own curiosity, their own desires and incentives, in the case of the miners. So it's not necessary to raise a giant venture round and fund a bunch of engineers to work on something that doesn't exist yet. You have a really interesting kind of emergent employment model. And then third-party developers, obviously it's permissionless, so anybody can build on this thing. So it is free infrastructure for anybody that wants to build a product or service, and they don't want to necessarily worry about whose backbone to use to build it, at least as a payment rail. So my conclusion from all this is that managers, in their effort to give workers what they want, have pretty much rendered themselves irrelevant. If we can take companies like GitHub and Spotify as examples. So Spotify is really interesting because when I was at Undercurrent, and I know this is true of other consultancies too, Spotify, and you talk to anybody, in especially New York tech, because Spotify has a big office in New York, Spotify is the company to emulate when it comes to org design, incentive structure, role design. I think it's probably every Google and Facebook HR's first stop is the Spotify career site when they're designing new roles and trying to hire new people. And Spotify has two really great and long videos, 2 hours talking about how Spotify works. It's on YouTube. It's called How Spotify Works, Part 1 and 2. I highly recommend it. You can see here, it's one of these animated videos, and you can see here they have a bunch of little SLAM teams, and then under that sort of membrane, that green membrane, it says loosely coupled, tightly aligned squads. So loosely coupled meaning there's nobody telling them to work together, but they're tightly aligned in the sense that if they're both trying to solve a common problem, they build infrastructure together, they choose their own tooling, nobody tells them you got to use this service or this hardware or whatever. It just sort of naturally works. Okay. So I think what this does is it essentially puts the people that are creating the value together and lets them work without really the interference of administrators, planners, allocators, other people that earlier I called the technostructure. So there's very little for management to do in here as long as somebody is paying these people and keeping their health benefits active. So this is. I don't want to put too fine a point on this, but this is kind of dangerous. If you're a C-suite executive and you've convinced yourself that you run the company, that you're the manager, and yet you don't actually have a proper say in what's being built or how it's being built, are you really the CEO of that company? What do you call yourself? I think that there is going to be very little for management to do, and I think a lot of the back and middle office functions, which are mostly there to deal with the fiat currency system, whether it's accounting or payroll or tax or whatever, I think maybe not in 25 years like the last panel said, but maybe in 5 or 10 years you start to see people really totally automating the back and middle office functions such that there is a thin veneer of owners or maybe a couple of managers and then just a whole lot of people that are doing the actual technical work. So I'll use another real-life example of how companies with traditional hierarchies try and sort of fail repeatedly to emulate this process. So at BlackRock, about, I guess, 4 years ago, I did a project where they were trying to come up with a way to sell financial products direct to consumer. So if you don't know too much about BlackRock, they are a large asset manager. They create a bunch of financial products that you may or may not have, like ETFs, for example, that you buy through your brokerage. But a lot of people don't buy these things directly, like through something like Fidelity. They go through what's called a financial advisor, which is a kind of loose term for a freelance salesperson. There's no accreditation involved with being an FA, but they're really good salespeople. They have kind of personal relationships. They're kind of like insurance brokers or travel agents. They sort of sit between the service that matters and the customer, and they explain the service to the customer. So BlackRock can't stand these people. They have something like 30,000 of them, and they all take a cut. Every time they sell a financial product, the FA gets a cut. So they brought myself and my team in to figure out how to get their digital marketers to design such good banner ad units that millennials would click right through and buy a product direct from BlackRock. And actually, it wasn't hard to make ad units that millennials would click on. It's very easy to. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I'll speed up. Let's see how many. All right, so we'll just zip through the end and go to any questions. This is sort of the outcome of all this, that Bitcoin lowers transaction costs. And in the absence of transaction costs, according to Ronald Coase, who is a Pulitzer Prize, excuse me, a Nobel Prize winning economist, in the absence of transaction costs, there is no economic basis for the existence of the firm. So this is why companies actually exist in the first place, is to make it so you don't have to go out every day and find new employees. But in an ad hoc employment scenario where you're offering up bounties or you're just using freelance labor, in a very low transaction cost environment, you basically don't need a company, and he actually posits that you don't even really need laws. I don't know if that's on this quote or the last, yeah. So in any case, that's sort of the bottom line of all this, is that by proving that people can make really effective services without management, you've sort of turned the whole structure of management into the emperor's new clothes, and I think people are going to start building a lot more products and services without anyone telling them what to do or how to do it. And that's it. Sure. Yeah.
Everybody give Chris a hand. He's awesome. I actually had the privilege of